Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Ashish Koul, who is at Yale as Singh Postdoctoral Associate in South Asian Studies. Her work focuses on caste, Islam, and politics in South Asia, with law and gender as components within that framework. Today, we'll talk with Professor Koul about her essay, Making New Muslim Arain, Reform and Social Mobility in Colonial Punjab, 1890s to 1910s. Welcome, Professor Koul.
Thank you, Marilyn, for having me here.
Sure. Let us begin with the paper that you recently wrote. Tell us about it.
Well, the paper is about the Arain community of colonial Punjab, mostly the early 20th century from the 1890s to the 1940s, as you said. Now, Arains were a largely agricultural Muslim caste in colonial Punjab who were classified by colonial law as agriculturalists. That basically meant that they were not, at least in the eyes of the state, that they were not commercial or artisanal castes, but castes that derived its livelihood mostly from agriculture and land ownership in one form or another. Okay. So they were about 8% of the population in turn of the 19th century Punjab, and mostly concentrated in the central districts of Amritsar, Jalandhar, Lahore, and Ambala.
Okay.
So the paper talks about this new attempt by some English-educated, urban and reform-minded Arain elite in the early 20th century to come up with a new sort of history for their identity. Now, this was partly in response to colonial characterizations of the Arains as good farmers who were really industrious, but were also in terms of land, in terms of size of land ownership, sort of in a middling status. So there were these other groups called Jats and Rajputs who were above them, who were big landlords. And then there were the non-land-owning communities like chamars, that is leather workers, or potters and other service-providing communities who were sort of all grouped together into this homogeneous category called the Kameen castes.
Okay.
So the Arains in the early 20th century, and this is what the paper focuses on, sort of start off a project of sort of writing their own history. And part of that project is sponsoring the production of a history called Salimut Tawarikh, which literally means a sound history. There's a longer title, but I'll spare you that.
Okay.
So the history, this is published in 1919, it sort of argues that the Arains, rather than being these middle rank, small time vegetable selling and small scale farmers of indigenous origin, which is what the colonial state claimed that they were in their own sort of colonial ethnographies. Now, this Arain history, which was written by this person called Maulvi Muhammad Akbar Ali Sufi Jalandhari, argued that instead of being these small-time, low-status farmers, Arains were actually of illustrious Arab Muslim descent. And he traced this genealogy all the way back to early Islamic Arabia in the 7th century, not claiming descent from the Prophet, which was significant in its time and place, but still sort of carving out a unique sort of genealogy that went all the way back to early Islamic Arabia without actually claiming descent from the Prophet.
Okay.
The important genealogical event in this sort of claim was the early 8th century Muslim conquest of Sindh, conducted by a Muslim general called Muhammad bin Qasim. And Jalandhari argued that the Arains in colonial Punjab were descendants of Muhammad bin Qasim's Syrian generals. So the glory that the genealogy brought in terms of being, an association with the bringing of Islam to the subcontinent was what he was basically after in sort of producing this genealogical self-imagination. And then the Arab genealogy then sort of facilitated the reinterpretation of some reformist Islamic tropes. And then combined with the genealogy and this adapted reformist program, Jalandhari then claimed that Arains were actually these high status Muslims of pure Arab Muslim descent whose social religious practices, things like endogamy and practices of women's seclusion, were derived from the Quran itself. And in saying that, he was distinguishing the Arains as much from high status Muslims, high caste or high status Muslims, as from lower status communities like the leather workers that I mentioned earlier. So this was an attempt to generate a new history and a new sort of bounded community grounded in this notion of both noble birth and ideal sort of Islamic piety.
Okay, and what led you to write this paper?
Well, this paper comes out of my dissertation project. So while writing my dissertation, this is one of the chapters that it sort of is the beginning of the project, but it's kind of chapter 2 in the dissertation. And while I was writing the chapter, I realized that the implications of this specific part, the scholarly implications of this specific sort of attempt at redefining, self-redefinition in a colonial context, had profound implications for scholarly literature on both reformist Islam in South Asia, and also the sort of scholarly understandings of how lower status communities achieve upward mobility in early 20th century South Asia. So then sort of that led me to decide that maybe this can turn into a good journal essay, which has a strong narrative component, but at the same time also has these important analytical arguments to put forward.
Okay. So, I am curious to know who Jalandhar, and am I saying that correctly? Jalandhar. Who was he, and he just decided I'm going to take this issue on and basically rewrite history, is what it's sounding like.
Well, yes, you're right, and no, so it wasn't as if this is some isolated person in one corner of the universe trying to write this.
Okay.
So the way it happened was that in the late 19th century, colonial ethnographers, some of the most famous ones are Charles Tupper and Denzel Ibbetson, they started producing these ethnographies of the subject populations, and the whole project was, of course, this is colonial knowledge production, which is a deeply political project, where you do not want to know the subject population. It's not knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It is knowledge for the sake of policy development. So there is a sort of a profound political reason why those histories get produced about who these subject populations are, where do they come from. The primary motivation for the late 19th century Punjabi ethnographic project was to identify who owned land. And once you identify that, you can identify potential revenue payers. But then it's not enough to know who owns land. It's also important to know where land will go once the current owner is no longer in the picture. So that leads colonial ethnographers to ask questions about inheritance patterns, and then which then is directly linked to patterns of marriages, because as long as you have to know who gets to marry whom in order to understand who gets to inherit what. And these are the projects that are sort of developing in the late 19th century, the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And the Arain community, now by this time, Punjabi Muslims had been enrolling in government colleges and getting what was called English education at the time. So some of the prominent Arain leaders at the time, some of them were lawyers who had trained in England. They had come back and they were really concerned. There was this anxiety about the kind of history and identities that colonial ethnographies were producing. So out of that anxiety, out of this desire for quote unquote correcting the colonial perception of us, of our communities, came up multiple attempts at producing community histories of their own whose primary reason was to counter colonial perceptions of the community. So you see this trend among other Punjabi communities like Jats, and then also sort of coterminously there are community-based organizations, associations come up, and that happens also in the case of Arains. So these are like a bunch of these Arain lawyers and politicians and urban wealthy, influential men get together and say that we have to do something about the way the colonial gazetteers and all these colonial texts are portraying us. So it so happens that they end up almost appointing Jalandhar to write this history. And he starts doing the research for it in 1890s. And he doesn't do it all, like I said, in a sort of sitting by himself in a corner. He actually engages influential and well-known members of the Arain community by writing letters to them. So he writes these letters and says, here is a list of 35 questions about the community that I would like to have your answers to. And then that sort of intra-community ethnography then informs the kind of detail about the community that he puts into his book. So the production of this history then is sort of sponsored by self-conscious, educated elites of the community. And then this man who is appointed, who claims to be an Arain in the book himself, and I have no reason to not believe him at this point, but you never know, things can change.
Right.
So he almost gets appointed, and then once the publication of the book is delayed because of the First World War, shortage of paper and ink in South Asia, and then once it is published, a year later, the Arain Association of India sort of officially recognizes him as historian of the community, and says that this book is our official history. Okay. So that's how it sort of comes about, and he gets appointed, and he's a well-known author by that time. He's written books about Islam and about Arabia and about ideas of seclusion, and also has composed a commentary on the Quran. Okay. So it's sort of this weird ethnographic part, very conscious project of history, of production of a history.
Right, right. And I'm curious how you did the research for it, and were you able to see his correspondence with the leaders of that community?
So, so I started out on this project with a very different idea, but then as I did more research in India and Britain about it, I came across this book. It is a book, like it's a Salim al-Tawarikh, is an Urdu text. And once I sort of had a chance to peruse it, I had seen references to it in other Urdu texts of the period. But the first time I laid my eyes on it was in the spring of 2014. So I saw the book and I realized that something interesting, something really unfamiliar was going on here, both in terms of his approach towards what a good pious Muslim looked like, and also in terms of his approach towards how Arain community should sort of rejuvenate itself and claim a higher social status in colonial Punjab for itself.
And what were his ideas for both of those?
So, so in terms of social mobility, what he does is unique, because he doesn't take the well-worn and very familiar track of claiming descent from the Prophet or his family or the companions of the Prophet, basically the contemporaries of the Prophet, which is a more common genealogical mode of self-imagination in South Asia. Okay. You have other communities like Ansaris and also the Siddhis in Western India, who claim descent from different companions of the Prophet. Now, he doesn't do that. He claims descent, again, like I said, from someone called Sheikh Salim Rai, who he claims was someone who migrated to Syria, and then his descendants were enrolled into Muhammad bin Qasim's army and then ended up coming to Sindh as conquerors. So the point of that genealogy then is to claim that not only do Arain ancestors have Arab blood, but they also have something else, which is they were righteous Muslims who participated in the spread of Islam to the subcontinent. Now, within the regional limits of South Asia, this event, this early 8th century Muslim conquest of Sindh, is very well remembered through medieval chronicles, and is sort of marked as this paradigmatic event. Like this is the event of Islam's origins in South Asia. So it's recognized as this event. And then when a community in early 20th century Punjab tries to connect itself in genealogical terms with that event, it's a way to claim sort of the honor that comes from not just blood, like birth is at the end, and Jalandhari says that in his work, that birth is a mere accident. That alone is not going to give you such social status. You must earn this status by sort of correcting your conduct. Okay. And claiming these ancestors who sort of brought Islam to the subcontinent, who were these righteous warriors, then brings in that element of ideal Islamic conduct and piety. Okay. So then the combination of the two then is what makes his representation of colonial Arains a direct refutation of colonial ideas about the community.
And what conduct specifically is what I'm interested in?
So the notion of ideal Islamic conduct in Jalandhari's writing is complex, but I'm just going to sort of break it down here very quickly. So there are different aspects to it. The most important is the intellectual aspect, which is about, which basically concerns about the ideal Arain man or woman's approach towards education and learning. So he sort of not only does he sort of encourage Arains to learn about their religion, but also have an open mind towards things like English education, which about 30 to 40 years before Jalandhari's time was not very popular amongst Muslims. Most sort of aristocratic and high status Muslim families did not really want their children going to English medium or any government institutions of education. So the idea that the Arains, because they have this Arab blood, have this predilection for for intellectual pursuits. They make sure that their children learn the Quran. There's a mosque in every village. So those kinds of details come in order to shore up the notion that that the intellectual aspect is sort of present among the Arains, but also needs to be promoted. The second aspect is about social ideals, social and religious conduct. So in addition to saying things like, because we are of Arab descent, we practice caste and dogma because we want to protect the purity of our bloodline, so to speak. So in addition to claims like that, he also sort of exhorts fellow colonial Arains to make sure that all their marriages are endogamous, and also the idea that that Arain widows were allowed to remarry, which was not something high caste Punjabi Muslims. That's something that high caste Muslims everywhere and Hindus also frowned upon. So it's a simultaneous attempt to distinguish Arain intellectual and social religious practices from those of high caste and lower caste Muslims. Right. And the final aspect then is economic, which is also very important for him, because for him then the economic aspect means both earning an honest living. So not sort of living off of an income, let's say like rent, where you don't work for a life for your money, but you let your ancestral wealth sort of take care of you and your children. So that is not ideal, and that is where the criticism that is where Jalandhari's criticism of high caste landlords comes in. So he's like, this is not what you want to do. You want to make an honest living because that is what the Prophet Muhammad asked all believers to do. And then also the flip side of that is to also pursue ideal spending habits, where you don't spend too much on lavish weddings and festivities, but sort of maintain this pure and almost ascetic lifestyle in sort of imitation of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Okay. So these specific aspects that he sort of points to exemplary Arains who already do this, but then also says that the rest of you also need to sort of follow these particular things. Yeah.
So I'm curious to know how this rewriting or revisionist history was received by everyone else. Was there any pushback? Was the genealogy ever challenged, for instance? It's notoriously difficult to track the reception of texts like this, most often because, I know that the 1,000 copies of Jalandhari's book were sort of produced in 1919, but I don't know where. I mean, I kind of know where 2 out of those copies are at the moment, but I don't know about the rest. So in his own time, there was some pushback. So there was another history of the Arains produced in 1922, which basically claimed that the Arains were of indigenous descent, like all other Muslims in South Asia. And this whole idea of Arab descent could not be proved either way. So a response, to the best of my knowledge, there was not much response from within the community in the colonial period. In the 1930s and 40s, some military handbooks do show evidence of, there were these military handbooks that were produced for British officers. And they would have these short little introductions to each community from which the soldiers in the army were recruited. And Arains were one community. And the descriptions in those handbooks would say, sort of Arains, they are descended from Muhammad bin Qasim's Syrian soldiers. So that's the kind of evidence that I've seen in terms of reception. So this origin story, this origin narrative seems to have percolated into the official colonial sort of understanding of these people. But the response from within the community then is post-colonial. So there was another history of Arains produced first in 1963, which is now on its 5th edition in Pakistan, and it continues to be printed and reprinted. The most recent edition is from 1989, and it sort of again makes the same claim, written by somebody else called Ali Asghar Chowdhury, makes the same claim that Arains are of Arab descent, but takes issue with the specific genealogical nodes of Jalandhari's sort of text, and says that Ali Asghar Chowdhury, for instance, says that I have found no evidence of this person called Sheikh Salim Arai, and in fact the Arai ancestors did not come from Syria. They actually came from Banu Umayyah, which is the first Islamic caliphate, the dynasty. All right, this is fascinating. So is there a story written for all of the different levels in the caste system? In terms of, so there's the story that Jalandhari wrote for the Arains, and then it's subsequently been updated, so to speak. Are there other groups in the caste system that also have stories?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. In the Punjabi, so caste in Punjab is a different sort of animal than in the rest of India. It's caste crosses religious lines in South Asia. So I know that the common notion is that caste is a Hindu phenomenon, but I think part of my research is to show that it actually isn't, and that it is particularly insidious because it persists despite conversions and it crosses these religious lines, so that you have high caste and low caste communities in all religions in South Asia. And in Punjab, the high caste groups like Rajputs and Jats, they have their own genealogies. I think I said it before that the genealogical mode of imagining your identity is not new in South Asia. So in sort of adopting that way, in sort of adopting that method, Jalandhari was actually following the example of a lot of other communities around him, and also much before him, centuries before him. So in addition, so for instance, royal genealogies would be produced, very actively produced, where these particular experts in genealogy would be recruited to write the genealogy of the royal household. Similarly, Sufi genealogies of the Sufi saints, their genealogies would be meticulously recorded. High caste Muslims, Muslims who claim descent from the Prophet's family, have meticulously recorded genealogies going all the way back to the Prophet's family, sometimes to his daughter, sometimes to his daughter's children. So those are the meticulously recorded like ancestry. But for genealogy, although the mode of imagination is similar to that, he adopts the same method. The specific sort of people that he identifies as ancestors, it's the track that he takes that is unique. So he doesn't. So in fact, rather than saying that, oh, we are also descended from the Prophet, which is the usual way of South Asian Muslims claiming high caste or high status, he actually doesn't claim that. He distances the Arains from Sayyids and says, we are not like those Sayyids. Those Sayyids, they don't do anything. They don't have an occupation. And we are the kind of Muslims who follow the Prophet in pursuing an honest living. And we believe in honest labor. And we do not think that manual labor, which is what cultivating the land would be, is sort of denigrating at all. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad himself told one of his followers that the only way to alleviate your poverty is to work your way through it. So, so there's this active attempt at, fabricating this genealogy, but then also each node that is chosen has a purpose. It sort of reflects a certain value. So the notion of honest economic labor would distance the Arains from high caste Muslim landlords who don't really work for a living and look down upon those who engage in manual labor. And then the ideal social and religious conduct would again distinguish the Arains from high caste landlords whose culture is very different and who in this time and age, in the late 19th, early 20th century context, are not associated with Islamic piety. And then at the same time, it would differentiate the Arains from lower caste communities whose religious imagination is very different.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how your research is kind of unique in terms of this essay from other other work that is out there today.
Right. So the essay makes two sort of broad, big interventions. The first is in the the literature on social mobility among South Asian Muslims. So the standard sort of way of understanding how lower status Muslim communities achieve upward mobility is there's this sociological model called Ashrafization, according to which lower status Muslims will first imitate the social religious practices of higher status Muslims, and then over several generations eventually also claim the name of a higher status community. So in the Punjabi context, it would mean, if we were to take the Arains as an example, it would mean that this one Arain community in this one village, where the Jats are the dominant community, over time start imitating social religious practices of Jats, the most common one being seclusion of women. And then over 3 or 4 generations, then start calling themselves Jats. So the Arains then, over the course of this gradual process, become Jats, so to speak, right? Now, my argument is that Jalandhari's sort of vision or his sort of argument for Arain identity is completely different from this. So although he relies on dissent and notions of, on both dissent and religious practices, the track he takes is not Ashrafization. primarily because he does not actually claim descent either from the Prophet, which is one way he could have gone towards Sayyids, and he doesn't claim that the Arains are actually Jats. He doesn't claim that. For him, Arains have a specific genealogy which within itself contains all the elements of high status. The only thing colonial Arains need to do is to remember it, because they have sort of forgotten it after centuries of habitation in South Asia amid all these other different religious communities. So the idea there then is to not become Jats or Sayyids, but to remain Arais, but to recalibrate what the Arai name then means by arguing for this Arab genealogy, and also all the ideal sort of Islamic piety that it sort of attributes to Arais who are of Arab stock. So because you have Arab stock, therefore you are innately sort of inclined toward true Islamic piety.
Right.
So that's one. So it's a very different model of upward mobility in this context. And the other contribution is on understandings of what reformist Islam means to Muslims who practice it. So the notion of reformist Islam, the central idea is that the Islam as practiced by 20th century Muslims is sort of corrupted, and it has too many un-Islamic or non-Islamic cultural accretions, which are usually labeled custom. And the reformist project then is to get rid of all those un-Islamic practices and ideas and go back to an ideal Islam of the prophetic age. So now most of the scholarly literature on reformist Islam among South Asian Muslims sort of has this, I mean, it's a vast and varied literature, but it has this sort of predominant inclination towards reformers, their ideas and their institutions. So we hear a lot about Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Ashraf Ali Thanvi, Sayyid Amir Ali, all these different sort of strands of reformist Islam, and that literature rightly emphasizes that reformism is a spectrum, and there is a Sayyid Ahmad Khan who is not a traditionally trained theologian but is still a reformist thinker, and there is someone called Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi who is a reform-minded theologian who is sort of traditionally trained. So that is definitely a spectrum, and I think that literature has done that work, and that is why I'm able to sort of take the next step. Right. And not to mention the gendered politics of reformist Islam, but my contention is that the Araini story allows us to move away from the institutional and the ideological focus and actually look at some provincial reform-minded elites who are interested as much in the tropes of reformist Islam, in the motifs of reformist Islam, as they are in pragmatic sort of methodologies for its implementation. So this is the instance of a community which is trying to adapt the ideals and the sort of the common tropes of reformist Islam, like, for instance, how are Muslim women to maintain their chastity? Or what is the ideal way, what is the ideal education for a good Muslim? So there is the ideal, there are all the reformers who are constantly sort of trying to teach South Asian Muslims how to be a good Muslim. So there is an element of that didacticism in Jalandhari as well. But the majority of this text is concerned with actually thinking about who the Arains are. They are peasants and farmers and landowners, and how they are going to implement these tropes in their own lives. So if we are thinking about the seclusion of women, for instance, now it's easy for a high caste Muslim family to seclude its women because it doesn't need the women to be part of the labor force. Right. But for an Arai farmer who has only a little bit of land on the outskirts of Lahore, he probably needs his wife working in the fields and then maybe selling whatever produce, which would very often be vegetables, and then going and selling it outwards. So how do you adapt the notion of female chastity, the reformist notion of female chastity, to suit an Arai farmer and his wife? So that is where Jalandhari, I think, offers an example, offers a very important departure in the way we conceptualize reformist Islam. That not only is it about didacticism and pedagogy, it is also about implementation. Right. So I think that is where my essay is trying to make an intervention.
Okay. Yeah. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
For more information about Professor Koul and her work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.